I was taking a breather from my usual rounds of the park. My day was predictable enough. I rolled around the paved roads in the park, looking for anything suspicious or illegal. Ended up just waving to everybody and stopping for a dozen coffee breaks like this one. I poured me a cup right up to the brim, and it was still very hot, piping billows of steam to the cold air. Well, that coffee ended up in my lap. It wasn't just a little jolt. It was the entire cup, to the point that I thought I had been sterilized. If you've ever spilt hot coffee on your lap or your groin, you'll probably know and feel what I'm talking about. Somebody had ran past my cruiser window and yelled as loud as possible, scaring me half to death, causing the scalding spill. I didn't get a good look at who did it, but, judging by the fits of giggling, it had to have been a small child. They ran into some tall grass, and all I saw was the grass folding in behind them. I appreciate kids, and I try not to leave them with the impression that the man is going to come and get them at the moment they step out of line. But that coffee, it hurt me pretty bad, and I was just mad enough to go looking to deliver a little 5-minute lecture. So, I took to chasing the kid, and it wasn't hard to do. As much giggling as they were seized with. Too funny for their own good, apparently. Despite how easy it was to stay on their trail, the kid managed to stay ahead of me by several paces. Quite an impressive feat, since I considered myself very much so in shape, and I figured I was hard to outrun. I was trying to gauge the age on this one. The grass came up to my waist, and I couldn't see any physical details of my assailant, just the movement that they made in the grass. My commands to freeze and to stop in the name of the law were soon washed away in that insane giggling. A kid that short couldn't have been older than 6 years old. But he or she was doing such a good job of staying ahead. It was embarrassing, and it didn't help my level of outrage. Now, here's where I can only report what I saw and what I think happened. I can't explain it through any rational means, and I barely believe my own words as it is, so bear with me. This kid rocketed into a thick bunch of orange trees. Those messy things that drop those softball-sized green fruits. I knew right away that they were taking me onto a trail where it would be much easier to see them and catch them. The trail only ran in 2 directions, north and south, and it was mowed very regularly, so I could tell this wasn't just some random trail in the middle of the forest. 2 strange things happened though when I passed by that boundary of orange trees. First, I didn't see the kid, but the giggling was still there, and it seemed to be all around me. Second, the trail seemed to extend into the infinite. It was like that trick where you hold a mirror up to another mirror, and you've got a hallway into forever. Yeah, it was like that. And I've patrolled that trail on foot many times, and it was never that long. I felt my forehead for any sign of a fever, and the only thing I was sweating from was running. And just like that, the giggling was coming from a clear direction again. North. I chased after it, expecting to see either the kid making it or the end of the trail. But I saw neither. I stood and looked around, wondering if I wasn't just starting to totally lose my mind. It was when I slowly turned to the opposite direction that I saw something on the ground. Spattered and pretty broken up, but there was a trail of something dark on the grass and the fallen leaves. It looked like oil, but some of it had a red cast to it where the sunlight fell on it through the canopy. My heart had begun to sink, and I asked myself, now could this be blood? I jumped pretty hard at another burst of giggles coming from the thicket where the trail of stuff led off to. There I found, underneath the broad skirt of blue spruce, a patch of earth that had just been very recently disturbed. There, I found the body of a small boy that was just barely identifiable by looks alone. The real detectives found out that he had an Amber Alert out on him for well over a week, 2 towns away, which, for those that don't know, is probably at least 40 miles. My brain started filling in the blanks in my experience chasing that giggling, and my rational side didn't want to hear it. At all, as a matter of fact. Something changed inside of me that day, and not really for the better. I can't look at those trees very long anymore. In fact, I can barely get myself to ever walk that trail. Just in case I end up hearing that giggling again, I'll have a shootout with some scum on the run in a dark alley, but I don't ever want to hear that giggling again. Look, being on this job, it's not rare that you run into all sorts of weird stuff. In fact, many of the things you encounter, some civilians would determine as paranormal or even unexplained. But I guess on this job, you just learn to get used to it and brush it off your shoulders. But then you have experiences like this, where an episode that I can't really write off as anything logical. It really creeps me out and sends a chill down my spine. There's no explaining what I saw nor what I heard. If it really was his ghost, well, there's a reason that it led me to his body. Maybe his spirit wanted me to find his body. I don't know. Was he murdered? I don't know. Was he potentially kidnapped and taken here? I was never told. But again, it's just a part of the job that you have to get used to. And even now, I still don't feel like I get fully used to these things. This story of mine is why I had decided to become a park ranger. I had taken a dare to do exactly what we had been told not to do. Go deeper into the swamp after dark. We were one of the 3 families that went camping in southern Illinois, where there's less cornfields and more woodland and marshes and campgrounds. It's a pretty wonderful area, if that's your climate. And besides, not necessarily in the swamp, but there's nothing like an Illinois thunderstorm. And Indiana as well, since we do share neighboring states. The summers can get pretty brutal out here. Very hot and muggy. And if you're anywhere from the Midwest, you've probably visited these states, and you probably just know how it has its own culture. Anyway, back to my story. There were probably 6 or 7 of us kids altogether. Just enough of us to decide that we were going to get into trouble as soon as we were left unchecked. My favorite. I didn't have the greatest appetite for trouble, but I also didn't want to be stuck with the dirty looks from my friends that I'd surely get if I did not go along with them. I mean, as a kid, peer pressure is everything, and if you don't follow along, you don't want to be the sore sucker out, which is part of the reason why I made the decision to go along with. It was one of those wetlands where the trees were almost standing up on their roots, and said trees were huge and almost ancient. I bet they had been there for so long, hundreds, if not thousands of years, however old swamps are. There always seemed to be a mist that hovered wherever the water was. It would thin out at times, but never fully disappear. If you think in your head of a traditional swamp, well, you're probably not deviating too far. We were several nights into our camping trip, and the dark wetlands were alive with the voices of all kinds of unseen and terrifying things. What better way to keep things interesting than to dare everybody to go out and join everything living in the dark swamp at night? Something we were specifically told not to do. Our opportunity came soon enough. The adults thought we would listen to them when out of sight. And it was an era where it wasn't ridiculous to leave your children unsupervised at your campsite. The adults went to knock back a few drinks at the fire pit, just a few paces away where they could be less parents and more themselves. If you have kids, you'll know exactly what that's like. We got out our lanterns and plunged into the dark world that was roaring with night sounds. None of them necessarily pleasant. There wasn't any plan or purpose in motion once we acted on the dare. If there was, I had missed it long ago. I began to feel turned around, and I tried to spot my friends. Shouting would draw the attention of all of our parents. I couldn't hear anybody, and I lost sight of everything familiar. This is when I started to get scared. Being in an unfamiliar environment, with no sign of hope. If the din of the wetlands hadn't been so loud, I would have been able to hear my heart slamming against my ribcage, as the darkness and the things filling it with noise felt like they were closing in on me, teasing at my clothes and threatening to invade them and share them with me. I can't tell you the joy that I felt when I was certain that I had spied the wavering light of a lantern, surely carried by one of my friends. I called out as quietly as I could, without possibly alerting any lumbering adult. The light began to draw near to me. I felt so much better. I had found somebody. I beckoned to whoever it was to keep coming. But then they stopped. They wouldn't speak or otherwise answer me. I began taking unsure steps towards them, and the light retreated with each step of mine, and I felt panic working its way back up into my chest. I begged them not to leave me behind, but they wouldn't listen. The faster I dared to come toward the light, the faster it backed away. Something, I don't know what, grabbed my wrist, and I was sure that I had been assaulted by a bear, and I felt free to shriek. A human hand covered my mouth, and I was looking into the face of one of my friends. She asked me what my problem was, and if I was blind, stupid, or both. I had no idea what she meant. Was she crazy? Had the swamp driven her to such acts of madness? She lifted her lantern ahead of the path that I had chosen, and the feeble rays exposed the ground as bristling with thorny vines and shrubs, the spines like daggers. I couldn't think of who would lead me into that sort of trouble. The dare itself was bad enough, but to lead me into running into my own death? My friend's lantern was just bright enough to light up the ground near where the deceiving light hovered. It was just a split second of visibility. It revealed that the light was not in a lantern, and there was nobody to do any holding. The light was simply by itself. Then it was gone. I dread to think of what would have happened if my friend hadn't seen me running headlong into peril. Was that light somebody else that didn't make it out of the swamp? Were they also deceived by some guiding light? I don't know. And to this day it still haunts me thinking about. Like maybe there's some sort of alien energy leading people astray purposefully in the swamp, to be lost and engulfed by Mother Nature forever, for their bodies and their spirits to become a part of the earth. That's my biggest fear. I had gone back to my tent, and I made every excuse I could to stay in it. To this day, I get heart palpitations at the sight of most nighttime illumination. Fireflies especially. Guess where I'm at? So, fast forward in time, and guess where I, a park ranger, is at? Yep, those campgrounds. The only thing more terrifying than what happened to me is the thought that it could happen to somebody else if I'm not around. I haven't seen the light or anything like it since, but I'll always be looking for it, and the kids that might see it. I don't want that ever happening to anybody else. As I've gotten older, I've heard more and more stories dealing with aliens and UFOs. I don't know how much about aliens and UFOs I actually believe in, but I can't refute the continuous stories that I hear from people and campers alike. Things about strange lights and sounds in the forest and the swamps, and even seeing figures walking around, glowing apparently. Very weird stuff. Things that you would expect to see on the episodes of X-Files or even Mysteries of America. Stuff like that. Have I seen or heard any of that stuff myself? Not since what I did when I was a kid. And even then, as much as it scared me, I consider it fairly minimal because I didn't see any glowing figures or any light moving, per se, or any large banging sounds happening deep in the swamp. It's always a creepy place if you think about it. I had one gentleman, about a year or so back, explain to me that he had this tall, white, nearly translucent humanoid figure chase him out of the swamp while he was exploring. He seemed pretty scared by it, and didn't come off as a druggie tripping out in the middle of the swamps. So, I'm not exactly sure. Although I had to take his story with a grain of salt, because anybody can make up anything. But, pairing that with all the other weird stories that happens around these swamps, it's weird. I'm not saying there's monsters out there, but I am saying there's things we can't explain. Lights, sounds, illusions even. And, as a ranger, I have to keep aware of those things and ensure everybody's safety, which means I have to be extra cautious being in these environments. So, partially, I'm here to tell you my story and experiences, but mostly, I wish you would wish me luck. After I retired, I took a job as a park ranger. At my age, that meant sitting in the lookout part of the lodge and drinking coffee while wearing a uniform and keeping an eye out for anything out of the ordinary. You know, scary ghosts coming up on camera, a huge fire, maybe occultism, you know. Nothing ever really happened, which was fine by me. It made my job a lot easier. I mean, who doesn't want anything to happen on their job? But there was one day where my nerves shot from 0 to 100 pretty quickly. I can remember that it was cloudy weather, so I suppose there's some room to say that my eyes might have played some tricks on me. My post sits on the second floor of a lodge that is normally open to the public. People can come and go as they please within certain hours of the day, pick up brochures, look at certain animal bones kept behind glass. You know, one of those places you take your kids when there's absolutely nothing else left for them to do. Sure, it's a great place to have small talk with strangers, but it's also a place where I have to do my work. From my vantage point, up there in the Great Bay window, I can see trouble coming from a mile away. I looked down one day when the storm clouds were gathering thick, and poking above one of the bushes was the face of a woman. A beautiful one, to be exact. She was blonde and smiling a toothy grin. And, well, she seemed to be looking straight at me. But not just at me, into me. Like she was intimately looking into my soul. It was very charming to say the least for the first few seconds, I guess. But she didn't stop staring. She turned her head this way and that, and then looked back up at me, and kept the glare and the grin. I looked around to see if maybe I just thought I was in her line of sight. There wasn't anybody else on the ground. It was just me, and just her outside. So, not knowing what else to do, I just sipped on my coffee, very nervously. I heard of strange people roaming the woods, but I didn't think any of them would be cute young blondes. I pretended to not notice her, but she wasn't hardly fazed. She'd look one way, and then another. Once in a while, she might even completely turn around, but she always ended up facing me again, and her expression wouldn't change for anything. Against my better judgment, I went down to see if I can help her. Coming around behind the bush revealed that from her neck down, there was nothing. She was hanging from an eye hook that had been bored into her head, and she was strung up by some upholstery thread tied to one of the tree branches above her. Her lips had been stapled into a grin, and her eyelids had been stapled high so that she stared wide open. I know, it's one of the most disturbing cases I've ever dealt with. I reported everything, and she's still an unsolved case to this day. I didn't feel comfortable keeping with that job. And even writing this to you feels very uncomfortable to write about. I'm not sure if you're familiar with any of David Paulides' work, but his entire book series on Missing 411 details many accounts, just like mine, or similar to mine, of finding missing persons or even dead bodies among the forest and parks, all sorts of places. This is just one of my many disturbing accounts that I've had while working at that job. And if you do intensive search and rescue, sheesh, you will find a lot worse. And I don't even want to hear half of their stories, because they're just far too depressing and gruesome. I have seen more than my fair share of oddities during my time as a ranger, and always have plenty of stories to share, in exchange for a pint down at the local pub. Of course, the tales that get the biggest round of applause are always the times that I've spotted, or sometimes a party, or sometimes a couple. Let's just say it's generally people having a good time. It takes all sorts, and I've seen it all. Trust me. And being a ranger, you see your fair share of nonsense and debauchery. However, that's all just a bit of the harmless fun. And you don't want to hear about the steamy car windows. So, I'm writing to you because I want to tell you that this has nothing to do with any of that stuff. Those are stories that you share with your mates. This one, however, won't make you laugh or shout, "Nice one." This is probably the most terrifying thing I have ever witnessed, and you are the first person I have ever told it to. So, it happened one night, a couple of years ago. Now, despite my stories of finding couples in cars and doing other things out of the woods, I don't actually do a lot of shifts in the dark. Vandalism is minimal, and it is usually too damn cold to find illegal campers. But, every so often, something happens, and the bosses think it is a good idea for one of us rangers to perform a quick patrol in the van once the sun finally goes down. It just so happened that there had been a couple of nasty and unprovoked attacks a couple of towns over, and although police had no evidence of the Moors were linked in any way, the boss thought it would be good for the community just to see some sort of authoritative presence. So, off I go in the van to drive around and report back if I see anything suspicious. Apparently, his latest victim had managed to protect herself and had smacked him around the head before legging it. Good on her. Now, unless I happen to see a man waving a flag stating I'm a rapist, I wasn't entirely sure what I was meant to be looking for. Driving around the moors at nighttime is quite enjoyable, as well as the various pint-worthy stories. You get to see your fair share of British wildlife. Creatures your average Joe would never be lucky enough to catch a glimpse of. I'm speaking of things like badgers, foxes, deer, hares, all manner of birds. And once, a long time ago, mind a border collie that had escaped its owner and had been wandering around for days trying to find its way home. So at first, when I saw what I supposed was a dog, I wasn't actually scared. This creature was huge, and if I hadn't had the headlights on full beam, I wouldn't have seen it, since it was black as the night. It was facing away from me, even though it appeared to be the size of a small horse. I wasn't afraid, yet. Opening my car door carefully with the engine idling, I made to step out of the van to try and get it to come over. If it was a lost pet, it was likely hungry and would come to me if it thought food might be an offer. I whistled to it, calling it over, patting my leg. Then, my poor vision of this thing became very clear. It turned to me. Now, as I said, up until now, I wasn't frightened, but then, it looked right at me. I'm not really a big fan of horror movies in really any way. They're just not my cup of tea. But when I looked into that, this dog's bright red glowing eyes, I knew it was something sent straight from hell. I'm not a religious man at all. Until that moment, I didn't even know I believed in such thing as hell. But that thing in front of me could have been right out of the pages of a Stephen King book. I stood there for a moment or two. To be honest with you, I was frozen with fear. The pure malevolence exuding from this beast was like nothing I'd ever felt before. Yet somehow, I seemed to sense that whatever reason it was there, it wasn't for me. Regaining some of my faculties, I get back into the van, never taking my eyes off of it, and then sped out of there like there was no tomorrow. I didn't even sign off a report back to base. I drove home, crawled into bed with a bottle of Bell's, and down almost half the bottle before I finally passed out, trying to let my brain process with heavy inebriation and time. Next morning, I woke up with a banging headache and the answer phone flashing like it was Blackpool illuminations. Once I managed to prise my eyes open, I listened to my messages. Police were all over the moor. They'd found the supposed rapist, and he was dead. Although, it was presumed he died from exposure due to the freezing overnight temperatures. Alongside the untreated head wound, one of the officers claimed the guy looked as if he died of fright. A look of abject horror frozen over on his face forever. I knew right then and there exactly when they'd found him, and exactly what he'd seen. My only conclusion to this story is this man and I had both seen what they call a hellhound, come to Earth to claim the soul of a monster. These things are real, and there's no doubt that what I saw came from the very pits itself. Whether it was for me or somebody else, I'm not sure. But I don't think it was an accident that I happened to run into this creature, as bizarre as it was. So, if you yourself happen to run into anything strange or out of the ordinary, don't expect it to be a mistake. There's a reason for these things happening. And maybe it was putting a mark on me for a future reference. I guess I'll know soon enough. I've been a park ranger up here in Maine for a very long time. I'm sure many others who do the same job as me will give you the go-around, but I'm not going to be shy about it. I've seen all sorts of weird and wonderful things, but nothing that I would ever classify as scary or unexplained. That is, until now. Growing up, listening to Art Bell on Coast to Coast, and watching The Night Stalker, I had heard my share of alien encounters and things that go bump in the night. Whilst I love all that stuff, I didn't believe a word of it. Until now. You see, I was making a routine patrol one evening in a particularly dense wooded area up near the very top of Maine. There had been a couple of reports filed by hikers about mutilated moose being found on the trail. It's not the most unusual thing that can happen. You wouldn't believe what some predators do to their prey. But this, well, it was kind of unusual by the animal kingdom's standards. You see, these moose had been drained of their blood. If this was an episode of CSI or some cop drama, and we were talking about humans, they'd very likely presume that this was just a dump site, and the victim had been killed elsewhere. But this was a moose. Ain't no animal predator I know of that is clever enough to pull a Dexter. In fact, there's only so many animals that even go after and target moose, which again, makes it very limited. So, patrols were up to try and see exactly what type of creature was attacking our wildlife. I'd been driving around for hours when I saw it. Now, I have to tell you, despite being an avid fan of those cryptozoology shows and the like, as I said, I didn't believe in any of it. I just simply enjoyed it for entertainment purposes and thought it was nothing but a bunch of fan fiction. So, when I saw this thing over the ground, next to a fallen moose, let's just say I thought it must have been a coyote or something. Maybe some sort of deformed, mutated animal. I thought maybe a large, mangy coyote with grayish, scaly skin. Oh, and spikes going down his back. Definitely a coyote. Because, I'm telling the God's honest truth here, that was exactly what it looked like. Some sort of messed up mix between a dog and a reptile, with scaly, nasty looking skin, and real sharp lizard spines running down its back. Oh, and it had its head buried into the moose, as if it were sucking out the blood. I'm not ashamed to say that I did not get out of my truck. I just sat there, staring at this thing in front of me, trying like hell to somehow rationalize what I was seeing. Was I processing this correctly? Was I seeing some sort of illusion? Then, as I'm deep in thought, trying to process the horror before me, it turned and looked right at me. There was no way at this point now that I could pretend like it was some type of normal animal with some kind of weird mangy disease or mutation. No, sir. The head that looked at me was that of some type of reptile. It had huge bulging black eyes, razor-sharp teeth, which at the moment seemed to be dripping with blood. It didn't try to come near me, but quickly hissed at me and then shot off into the woods, like just my utter presence alone had disturbed it. I don't know how long I sat there in the truck, too damn scared to get out and look at the poor creature on the floor. I knew for sure without needing to check that it was indeed dead. Eventually, I willed myself out, one hand on my hip, just in case. I headed over to the moose, and just as I suspected, it was dead. I ain't no veterinarian, but I was willing to bet $1,000 that I knew why. 3 small holes appeared near its head, where whatever thing I looked at had seemed to drain every last bit of blood from it, and I caught it mid-heist. I dragged that poor damn beast onto the back of the truck and took her back. The so-called experts were baffled. Of course, I didn't dare tell them what I had seen, because as I said, I've watched enough of these shows over my lifetime that I don't need them to tell me. Although we never had any more unexplained moose deaths, but I swear to you right now, that reptilian-like dog creature I saw, I'm pretty convinced it was a chupacabra. And before you go off calling me fake for pulling a moose onto the back of my truck, it was still a very small adolescent moose. Not that big. I don't know exactly how the biology works with moose, if at any point they separate from their moms or how that works. But perhaps this one was pulled away from its mother, and, well, this creature had its way with it. Anyway, I'm fairly certain that I saw my first ever cryptid, and that, my friend, is a chupacabra. I know they're real, and while it seems odd to me that I've seen one of these creatures up in Maine, from everything I've heard, I would expect to see them down in like New Mexico or Arizona. So this was news to me, but I guess they're everywhere, and it just goes to show you that nowhere is truly safe. No matter if you're in the woods or even in your backyard, there's always something watching you. I have no doubt that you will have heard of the Grand Canyon. I mean, hell, you might have even visited at least once or twice. Maybe on a day trip, whilst escaping the depravity of the Strip for a while. Or maybe you just enjoy the nature of things and the scenery. For me, it was a bit of both. See, I grew up in Las Vegas, and as a lot of folk do, first couple of jobs I had were in those casinos. I seen enough in my time there to fuel a lifetime of nightmares. Drunken debauchery, people screaming, all sorts of crazy stuff. I needed out, for the sake of both my physical and mental health. A complete and utter change of career, and you couldn't get much more polar opposite than the casino host to a park ranger, could you? And let me tell you, I loved the drastic change. Of course, there were stories that some of the old hands liked to try and scare us new guys with. Tales of ghosts, the disembodied thudding sounds of something in the dark, sounding like a body landing on the ground, but when nobody else was around. There'd been a few accidental deaths there over the years, same as any place with a high number of visitors. People die at Disneyland each year, so of course things are going to happen here. But see, I believe in monsters. I'd seen my fair share of them back in those hotel rooms, and they're always human, real as you or I. No matter what the others said, I knew they were just trying to spook us, throwing silly ghost stories at us, trying to get under our skin, make us uncomfortable. I wasn't the spooking kind. That's why I'm pretty sure that what I heard that night, well, it must have been one of them pranking me. It didn't matter that I was meant to be the only one on that particular rotation. One of them could have snuck in. It's really the only way I can explain it. You see, I didn't mind volunteering for the third shift, and unlike most of them, I lived alone. I ain't got a wife or kids to worry about, and I'm perfectly at ease in the dark, with only myself for company. Even patrolling in a spot where, allegedly, a father and son fell to their death nearly 100 years ago. I didn't feel any cold spots, didn't see any orbs floating about, none of that crazy stuff. Like I said, I hardly believed in any of that BS anyway, because as I've told you, my experience with monsters was dealt in the casinos and the hotels. That is, until it all changed with this god-awful scream. It was an awful wailing scream that I had never heard before. In fact, it sounded like some lady was being murdered. I rose the alarm on my radio and grabbed my gun quickly. It sent shivers down my spine, and I felt an unknown terror like I'd never felt before. It was my instincts kicking in full. I called out, asking where she was, telling her I could help her. But I was only met with the silence of the night and more darkness. Nothing. I searched and searched, and by the time my backup arrived, I began to think I'd imagined the entire thing. What luck, right? Way to feel like a fool. Until my boss appeared. He had a very solemn look upon his face, taking me into the office after dismissing the others. He proceeded to tell me the full story. You see, around 100 years ago, this man and his son did accidentally fall to their death. But, even more tragically, the wife and mother happened to see it. A few weeks later, unable to cope with her grief, she had returned and flung herself to her death, intending to join her husband and son, screaming all the way down until she hit the hard bottom. And, of course, the anniversary of her suicide. Well, lucky me, it was exactly 100 years ago to that same day. I'm not trying to sit here and convince you that I encountered the cry of the motherly ghost, but what I am trying to convince you, that I heard something that I can't exactly explain, and although I want to chalk it up to my colleagues, I can't be exactly certain how they managed to do it, how they managed to match the timbre and the pitch and the volume of the scream, even imitating the fall all the way down the canyon. It was terrifying to say the least. And even though I don't consider myself a believer in ghosts, per se, it's made me reevaluate what I truly believe and what I feel is actually out there, waiting to be discovered.